Привет, Иван.
Привет, привет. Здравствуйте, коллеги. Привет, Сабина, привет.
Добрый вечер всем. Добрый день. Вечер.
Томский, добрый вечер.
Добрый день.
Привет, приветствую. Так. Ну, его придется подождать, товарищ. Да. So I think we can start. Can we? Should we? Okay, Tatiana says that we can. Okay, so hello, dear friends, dear colleagues. This is indeed an exciting moment for me personally, and I think for all of the guests today, because our meeting is devoted to the volume, to the handbook on EU-Russia relations, which is a product of a huge job done under the supervisory of Tatiana and Maxine. And believe me, that was a huge effort, undoable one, but we did it. So the handbook is unique. It unites, it organizes and unites the EU and Russian authors on key dimensions of our relations. And on the other hand, the book has been prepared in a very complicated moment of our relations with the EU, when the demand for sober and professional expertise is as relevant as it has never been before. It had never been before, right? Another interesting thing which we observed during the very start of the preparation, I remember our meeting in Leiden in early 2019, was that most of the participants, many of those who contributed to the volume, are the part of the EU-Russia expert network of the EUREN. And this network has been performing since 2016, if I'm not mistaken. Sabine would correct me if I'm wrong. Well, even earlier, we had the idea of this product, and for several years, Sabine and myself, we did our best to fuel the work of the EUREN, and most of those who are in this team, they are at the same time the authors of the book. We have never planned to do so, but it turned out that EUREN and the group of authors overlapped very closely. And it's a good sign in my view. So this means that this core group of experts can actually produce joint products. And this is a fundamental joint product. We have another one, by the way, a joint report, two joint reports of EUREN. Some ideas are reflected on the pages of the handbook. I believe that we need this product not just for our colleagues in the academia, but for younger generation, which is growing up at our universities, at our think tanks, and which which needs a lot professional materials for their studies of the EU-Russia relations. For me, particularly, it was an honor and privilege to take Tanya's invitation. Tanya, thank you very much for offering me such an opportunity to contribute on sanctions, the topic I'm dealing with quite heavily now. And again, this was very mobilizing because both Tanya and Maxine, they were very strict, in good sense of this word, demanding, punctual, and professional as editors, right? So chapeau to you. So well, EUREN itself is continuing its performance. So the handbook would fuel and stimulate our further endeavors. So this means that we can produce not just small text, but large texts. And I hope that this is not the last product we have produced in such a constellation of bright minds. So with this, let me stop and pass the word to next speakers.
Thank you very much, Ivan. It was definitely a mutual inspiration and cross-fertilization between the EUREN and the authors of the handbook. When we when we discussed the idea of the handbook, we had several ideas. We have several issues in mind, but there are three issues that I would like to stress specifically for this presentation. Firstly, we wanted to cover a broad spectrum of issues and views that exist in EU-Russian relations and on EU-Russian relations. And therefore, we are very grateful to the theme of the authors that we assembled at the end of the day. The theme that represents a wide variety of views, different nationalities, and also different disciplines, academic disciplines. The second aim that we had was to provide the material that will stand the test of time. And I hope we will discuss it today as well. But in order to stand the test of the time, we designed a particular structure of the book, but also structure of each chapter, which includes both the history of a particular area, the current state of the debate, and also some thoughts about how things will develop in the short term and in the long term. And lastly, we wanted our handbook to be very useful not only for the academia, not only for students and for scholars of EU-Russian relations, but also for practitioners in the broad sense of this word, for practitioners in terms of policymakers, for practitioners as business, for practitioners in terms of the civil society and transnational relations, so for journalists, for experts. And therefore, this presentation is particularly significant for us because we hope to see how the handbook, in fact, can be used not only in the academia, but also in the real world, in the world of policymakers. And we are very much looking forward to comments and discussions. I will stop here because we are very short for time, and I will pass it to Maxine.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. I'd just like to thank EUREN and RIAC for hosting this conversation with some of our authors. And also, this is the first opportunity that we've had to thank our authors publicly for giving up their time, their thoughts, and for bearing with us because, as Ivan says, we were quite strict. We're unfortunately in a time when the importance of EU-Russia relations is all too clear. When we were writing the chapters, and certainly when Tatiana and I were at the end writing the introductory chapter together, we were very, very conscious of that deteriorated state of relations. That is as much or perhaps even more so the case today. But actually, it's a note of optimism, I think, for all of us that we are meeting here, we are having this conversation, and this suggests that there is an awful lot of willingness on all parts to ensure that doors can be kept open for dialogue, for the exchange of views, and to build mutual understanding. I just want to say a couple of things about the handbook. First of all, perhaps people will notice that there are gaps. I remember that when we got the reviewers' comments back, we were asked why there was nothing on the Western Balkans, for instance. And it may be the case then that we'll be coming back to all our authors in a couple of years and saying we need to update the book. But actually, I think that Tatiana is right, and that we did work very, very hard to make sure that this could stand the test of time, to really cover the literature. And although an awful lot has happened in EU-Russia relations since we sent everything off to publication, actually substantially much is the same. So it may be the case that we have missed things, but we all hope not. And then the final thing that I want to say is that, and this was a word that Tatiana used a lot in her early conversations with me, that we had to make sure that the handbook was a bridge across our different communities. And so we have worked very hard not to ignore the differences, the challenges in the relationship, but to find ways, to find language where we can still communicate with each other. And we hope that the readers of the handbook will see that. I'll stop there for now and we'll hand over to Yanis.
Thank you very much, Maxine, and a warm welcome to today's session, also from Berlin. My name is Yanis Kluge, and I'm the coordinator of the EU-Russia Expert Network on Foreign Policy. So in short, EUREN, the acronym that you already heard several times today and that you also saw on the agenda. And in the interest of time, I would just say a couple of words about EUREN, for those of you who don't know us yet. So EUREN is a platform for dialogue among foreign policy researchers and think tankers from both Russia and the European Union. It is part of the project Public Diplomacy EU in Russia, which is funded by the European Union, and it is organized in cooperation with the Russian International Affairs Council. And currently we have about 40 Russian and EU-based members, so prominent researchers from both sides, who regularly meet and write, engage, exchange perspectives, and so on. And I think that our discussion today and the handbook that we will be speaking about, it perfectly exemplifies what EUREN does and stands for. And I think that about a dozen members, EUREN members, also have contributed to the book, which is great, although of course all the credit goes to Maxine and Tatiana for putting it together. So if you're interested in the EU-Russia Expert Network, you can find out more about us online, on our website or our Twitter account. And I will leave it at that and hand over to Tatiana now, who will be the chair of our first panel. Tatiana?
Yep. Thank you, Yanis. We are under a very short schedule, so I suggest that each speaker takes 8 to 10 minutes maximum, and then we will pass to the discussion. And our first panel covers what I call transnational relations, relations among experts on EU-Russian relations. So that's a very nice bridge from the introductory speech to the substance, and also relations in the field of the academia. And our first speaker is Sabine Fischer. Sabine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. And thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm really, really happy that EUREN took up this idea that we discussed already last year to present this really seminal handbook to a larger audience. I hope, I haven't looked at the list of participants in my Zoom window now, but I hope from the EU and Russia. And on a personal note, I'm really happy to have been part of this project. I think this handbook is extremely valuable, and you really did a fantastic job in putting it together, and actually an impossible job, as Ivan already said. So congratulations to both of you. And I think, the result speaks for itself, so it's really great. Okay, so I'll try to be very brief. Tatiana, if I'm too long, you just have to interrupt me. Basically, Tatiana and Maxine asked me for the handbook to write about epistemic communities between the EU and Russia. And I will now shortly summarize the main findings, if you like, of my chapter. And I'm also very much looking forward to Alexander Gustarov's comments afterwards. So the concept of epistemic communities, as we know it today, originates from the 1980s and 1990s, when indeed transnational scholars, transnational networks of scholars emerged, particularly between the US and US/the West and the Soviet Union in the 1980s, and had an impact on decision-making processes in the context of the end of the Cold War in the second half of the 1980s. So these are the processes that informed and inspired the academic literature about epistemic communities. And the interesting question that we can ask today in 2021 is, do epistemic communities of this kind actually exist? Is it possible for them to exist between the EU and Russia? And could they possibly contribute to or make suggestions as to how the political conflict between the EU and Russia and the very dire state of the relationship since 2014 could be overcome? And this is basically what I deal with in my chapter. Now, epistemic communities, as defined by Emanuel Adler or Peter Haas or others, are networks of professionals with recognized policy-relevant expertise or knowledge. They can be national, they can be transnational, and as Tatiana already said, I mean, we dealt with transnational bonds, transnational ties here. So I look in the chapter, I look at transnational contacts between expert networks. And epistemic communities need to fulfill two criteria. One is internal cohesion. So they have to have a consensus on the messages that they want to deliver to policymakers on different sides. And that, of course, also precludes that they have a common interest in delivering those messages. So that's the first criteria. And the second criteria, of course, is that they have to have, in order to have an impact on policymaking, they have to have access to policy decision-making circles. Now, in my chapter, I look at the two respective contexts in which expert contacts between the EU and Russia unfold, and I focus in the chapter on the respective international relations communities. So experts, scholars, scientists working on international relations, international security, EU-Russia relations, and so forth. And what I find is that both expert communities, the one in Russia, but also the one or the ones in Europe, I come to that in a moment, underwent certain processes of consolidation, if you like, over the past 20 to 30 years. And I'm not going to bore you with any details here. If we look at Russia, I think it's pretty clear that the Russian expert community in this area, but also generally, went from near collapse in the 1990s because of the economic downturn in Russia after the end of the Soviet Union, to recovery in the 2000s, which was also, by the way, accompanied by diversification, both in terms of institutions. So traditional institutions, for instance, the Russian Academy of Science recovering, but also new research institutions emerging, and also with a view to topics. So if you look at international relations scholarship during this period, it basically turned away from a purely Western focused kind of science to more research on, for instance, Asia, China, and other international issues. So today we have a rather, and of course, during that period, also the Russian state was retaining and taking more control of scientific activity. So what we have today is a rather diversified scientific research and think tank landscape and a foreign policy discourse in Russia that is diverse. So I think this is very important also with a view to Western audiences to really stress that there are many different positions with regard to foreign policy, making international relations, etc. But still there is a rather predominant mainstream discourse, if you like, which is very much informed by neo-realistic thinking on international. In this sense, it is very different from the Russian landscape or situation. And yeah, it is much more diverse because we have to deal with 27 member states, and the scope and depth of research on Russia and many other issues, of course, in the individual member states really depends on their size, their geographic location, and also their foreign policy interests. So it is a much more diverse field. I would like to mention two aspects, and for the rest, I refer you to the chapter. One aspect, I think, which had a lot of impact on research on Russia over the past 24 years, is the general marginalization of area studies in the academia, which I think affects Western academia in a very, or affected Western academia substantially. And this is something that basically discourages young researchers, students, etc., from embarking on such a path, from researching, focusing specifically on countries, on regions, on specific regions, which then also, okay. Okay, so this is something that then caused very serious recruitment problems also for research institutions, think tanks, etc. The other aspect I would like to mention is Europeanization. So what we have seen over the past 10 to 20 years, I would say, is indeed a process of Europeanization of foreign policy discourses, including within expert networks, because this is, I think, a natural consequence of European integration, but it was also purposefully supported by the EU itself and also by member states. So we saw a lot of exchange, and we still see a lot of exchange and rapprochement of national perspectives. Okay, third and last point, are there expert communities between the EU and Russia today? In the chapter, I describe a few expert dialogues, as I call them, so joint scientific exercises, research projects, etc. But I come to the conclusion that these are indeed contacts, dialogues, but that there are no expert communities in the sense of the definition that I quoted to you at the beginning, because in most areas, the views of the experts involved are too different and too far apart in order to formulate common positions or even common messages that could then be disseminated and communicated to policymakers. And in many ways, if you look at the expert dialogues, they reflect the political conflict between the EU and Russia very much. And I think this is an experience that we also made within the EU-Russia Expert Network on Foreign Policy. So what we achieved, I think, was a lot of trust among the members in the sense that they could openly and freely exchange and discuss their respective opinions. But it was very difficult, and we also were productive. So lots of papers were published over the past 4 years, but it was still very difficult for us to formulate common positions. So in a nutshell, I would say that expert communities between the EU and Russia today lack cohesion. So they're not able to communicate strong messages. Still, it is very important that they exist because for exchange of information, trust building, and also I think as a resource for the future. And my very last point is that, of course, we all know that the pandemic exposes us to a huge problem, because our possibilities to do exactly that, to exchange and to engage, are very limited because of the pandemic. And I would like to conclude with a question, actually, because I mean, I looked at experts, scholars working on international relations, but I think it would be very interesting to also look into other areas where epistemic communities actually might emerge. And I think one very interesting area could be climate change. So this should be, I think, a question that that should be explored in the future. That's that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sabine. And we move to another area of transnational relations straight away, to academic exchanges, to the academic dialogue, academic cooperation, and how that can contribute to trust. Larissa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tatiana. I'm very happy to see everyone and not wasting time for greeting, but still love, and thank you very much for doing this great, impossible, still possible jobs that we have in hands. I will try, first of all, my chapter in this handbook is written as a collaboration with my Finnish colleague, Sirkki Mäkinen, and it's our second publication on the same topic, developing the issue of academic cooperation between EU and Russia. And for this particular publication, for this particular chapter, we had a question, several research questions, because we see that academic cooperation between EU and Russia became more and more driven by the public diplomacy logic, and it's considered to be a soft power tools. So for us, it was very important to see what are political and cultural rationales and social and academic rationales of the actors from EU and Russia side. And we also consider that actors are very different. They're supranational and national actors on this level. At the same time, we are dealing with institutions and with people, and some quite different actors. So we had 3 research questions that we put for our chapter. We were interested to analyze if institutional level and individual level actors from the EU and Russia, they share political rationale of their national and supranational actors. We also were interested if actors of different level from Russia and the EU, they share objective and interest and cooperation in general, talking about academic cooperation, its social and economic and cultural aspects. And we also were interested if economic and academic rationale of EU and Russia are compatible. So what we find out reading through a lot of academic scholarship on this topic, I just mentioned that it's still the scholarship on academic cooperation, it's much less in volume than in, for example, security issue or energy, etc. So this is much less, but still it's a lot of written in English and in Russian. It was 2 languages that we used publication on. What we found out that this cooperation is understood very differently. For the EU political rationale in 90s, what about Europeanization of Russia, of higher education in Russia. And in this sense, it was more about democratization in the context, academic culture. And for Russia, it was more about economic rationale and more about approximation in normative regulation and building this what called Bologna process and European higher education area to Russia to be part of it. And this decision was made top down, which is many Russian expert stress in their publication. So what we also saw the debate about that this academic cooperation was seen from Russia side as a way to modernize higher education and as a part of the Bologna process, but was more concern of Russia than European Union countries. It was another part of this discussion, or the key debate that we call it. It was about asymmetric nature of cooperation, and this was manifested in the fundings, because most fundings came from the EU side. And it was not only concerning for the reform, but also for mobility flows, because the more mobility was funded by the EU side, and more people from Russia traveled to the EU within European projects. We also find asymmetric in responsibilities of partners. Only since 2006, Russian university became start to participate more actively, being so-called contractors, holding the contracts. And as we know, it's last only 8 years. In 2014, it's not possible anymore. Only Jean Monnet program remain as academic cooperation, and those who participate in the competition know how high it is in the last 8 years. It just stopped. So to conclude, what we find out that there is divergent rationales of the EU and Russia in academic cooperation, economical and political in 90s. And it was also different vision of this type of academic cooperation from institutional level in regard to productivity or a positive result of cooperation, and also expectation of a short-term and long-term effect. So what we find out that actually the trust emerged on a level of individual and institutional between EU and Russia partners as universities. At the same time, there is both sides at institutional level, supranational and national level. They see that their political rationale are very different, but it does not seem as a reason to stop cooperation. So I probably should stop here. And just the very last words that I want to say, research, we continue this research, and I prepare the publication on the same issue, analyzing rationale dealing with individual level of those European students who came to Russia to study and those Russian students who came to EU university to study, and how their evaluation of their experience is different. And it's very interesting how it's merged or it's different with expectation of institutional level cooperation. But what we find out that also so-called more Europe or Europeanization of Russia had happened through this academic mobility and through this cooperation, because those people from Russia who participated, teachers, staff, and students who did participate in this European project, they built more trust and more respect toward European academic culture, as we see it's a more democratic, more egalitarian, and very different way of communication between teachers, students, and in general among colleagues. So I will stop here. Thank you very much. We need some time for answer to our question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Larissa, also for respecting the time limits. And I'm very happy now to pass the floor to Alexander Gusarov, who knows ins and outs of EU-Russian relations as a practitioner. So Alexander, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tatiana. Thank you for the very warm representation. Can everyone hear me? Is everything clear? Okay, thank you. Dear colleagues, well, thank you for inviting me, first of all. And at the outset, please allow me to offer my heartfelt congratulations to our colleagues from the Russian International Affairs Council on their 10th anniversary. The Russian MFA invariably relies on the prolific expertise, the sound judgment, and the plethora of international partnerships, including through the EUREN, that RIAC maintains. So we wish you all the best. Let me also warmly thank the two authors of the chapters that I had the pleasure to study, Ms. Sabine Fischer and Ms. Larissa Dereglazova. In my opinion, both studies merit praise for their focused, detailed, and nuanced elaboration of the Russia-EU interaction in the academic and the scientific sphere. I think should the other chapters, which I have not yet read, of the Rutledge Handbook be as engaging and informative, then certainly the book hopefully will become an important milestone in the ongoing deliberations on the way forward in the Russia-EU, the not uncomplicated the Russia-EU relationship. In practical terms, please allow me just a couple of points on the two chapters. First, I feel I'm quite sympathetic to Ms. Deriglazova's very assiduous recap of the institutional backbone of the Russia-EU science and technology cooperation. Indeed, I think we should not underestimate the degree to which this cooperation was and remains assured by the political will manifested in our common acquis, including the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, the relevant fourth roadmap on cooperation in research and education, including cultural aspects, as well as the Science and Technology Agreement and the work of the relevant Joint Committee. We were, as Larisa Deriglazova quite rightly noted, we were aiming quite high at a certain point in time to reach a common European higher area of education. And ironically, the year 2014 was supposed to have been the Russia-EU Year of Science, but the subsequent turn of events and the unfortunate decision, in my view, to freeze most channels of our dialogue, including the vast majority of the working groups that were formed under the aegis of the Joint Committee, has certainly not made things better for scientists. If anything, this remains an important factor in impeding the consolidation of scientific, or to use Sabine's term, epistemic communities between Russia and the EU. Secondly, I subscribe to the very valid point by Sabine that Russia-EU relations were sort of going downhill long before the events of 2014. And by extension, this, I think, relates to the academic cooperation as well. I recall quite vividly, as a younger diplomat than I am now, back in 2011, how we were finding it more and more difficult, for example, to underpin noteworthy academic projects like the MGIMO European Studies Institute with substantial joint resources. Although this was one of the objectives on our roadmap. And there were other examples of the asymmetry to which Larisa referred to that were, to put it bluntly, not very much in sync with our jointly stated intention to move towards a more equal and strategic partnership. Third, I think it's quite correct for Larisa to describe the divergent rationales that were present in the relationship, also in the academic sphere, the influence of the transformation, or the way she describes it, democratization politics of the European Union. I think this is really hitting the nail on the head. So going forward, I think there is a need to make sure that whether we are talking about academic mobility or university cooperation, things like developing a joint curriculum, or twinning programs, etc., we are on the same page that this cooperation should be pragmatic, depoliticized, and interest-based with no hidden agenda. I think the same should apply to our bilateral legal framework, like the S&T agreement, which today, because of political linkages, is lingering for some years now in a kind of a normative twilight zone. So if indeed epistemic communities are to take shape, then I think we need to invest more in ensuring a kind of a level playing field for scientists. But I think just to leave on a positive note and to sum up what I think are very good and positive two chapters, I'd like to single out the positive thrust of the role of Russia and EU academia in times of unpredictability and turmoil in our relations. This cooperation remains a positive intersocietal force that contributes to building mutual trust. It constitutes an important mechanism for sustaining communication and generating fresh ideas. And this applies especially to areas where positions may fundamentally diverge and where diplomats and politicians dare not tread. But it also applies to a host of new issues, new areas, like climate, which Sabine mentioned, or energy transition, or health, or digitalization. And I think in this vein, while of course, by all standards, this is a challenging process, but I think the formulation of joint academic perspectives is of paramount significance. Indeed, on our side, we can only welcome the work being done by our colleagues from Russian think tanks and their EU counterparts. Over the past few years, a number of publications have made waves, among them the Egmont paper on how to reverse in a one-way street just this year, the Principled Pragmatism in Practice, a book by the Ghent University, as well as, of course, last year's EUREN, EU and Russia 10 years from now study. And of course, while these studies may comprise a variety of differing and at times very divergent viewpoints and projections, the intellectual exercises that go into them by themselves are incredibly important in the overall objective of finding a new balance in the Russia-EU relationship. So hopefully this very kind of European rationalism, which is at the heart of modern science, will continue to be the brick and mortar that binds our countries closely together, even in the face of some adversity. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexander. I suggest that we open the floor to questions now, and then we'll get back to authors if they want to comment and respond to Alexander. There are two ways to ask questions. You can either do it in the chat or you can do it through the raised hand feature of the Zoom. Well, I have questions to the authors, and then maybe there will be others coming in. Well, my first question is to Sabine. Well, Sabine, how can we promote epistemic communities in EU-Russian relations? Like, what are the ways, and shall we promote epistemic communities in these relations? And I think I like your idea about epistemic communities in the field of Green Deal and environmental issues. Maybe we can also look at other fields like physics or medicine, the areas that are not closely involved in sort of like today's political discourse in EU-Russian relations. Larissa, my question to you is, what can both sides do to improve academic cooperation? I think we frequently address policy recommendations to the European Union, but the question is also, what can Russia do in this field, or can Russia do anything to improve academic dialogue and academic relations between Russia and the European Union? Alexander, you frequently use the word politicized and depoliticized. So when you use the word politicized, what do you exactly mean? Politicized, well, politicized in scientific and technological cooperation, or politicized in academic dialogue. Can you specify what that means? And how can we depoliticize that? And what can Russia do in particular to depoliticize it? I suggest that we go back to Sabine, then Larissa and Alexander, because I think both of us might have comments to Alexander. And then if there are extra questions, then we can take them. Sabine?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, Alexander, for really excellent comments. And I'm glad you liked the chapters. That's really very, very positive and nice feedback. Thank you. Let me very quickly make three points. I mean, on what Alexander said about the relations going down already before 2014, I agree. I would still like to stress that specifically in the area of research and science, but also education, there is a great interest on the European side. And I think also I hope on the Russian side, to maintain these contacts. From a European perspective, I think they are also, I mean, these contacts have a very important function. They're people-to-people contacts. And this is something that the EU has very high on its agenda generally, but also in its relations with Russia, as you know. So I think here the EU remains extremely interested and also ready to do many things to make this possible. On epistemic communities and how they could be brought into existence. I mean, this is how I understand what Alexander said, and also Tatiana, your question goes in that direction. And I would like to make it very clear here that, I mean, of course, governments, state institutions can support research activities and exchange between researchers and scholars across borders. And I think this is very important. And the more they do of this, the better. But then I think it's also very, very important to understand that the emergence of epistemic communities is something that needs to happen bottom up as well. So it's really something that happens between and among the involved researchers. And I think for this, if you look at what governments should do, or what should happen at the political level, I think freedom of science and research is an extremely important precondition for this. Freedom of exchange, freedom of opinion, and of course mobility. And this is why I stressed at the end of my short presentation that the pandemic is really not helping us, because it prevents us from having these contacts. It's a huge, huge problem, which among other things makes me, I mean, I really hope that, for instance, the negotiations that are ongoing now about mutual recognition of vaccine certificates lead to a success, because, and lead to an agreement, because, I mean, I think we all suffer from this situation, and it really negatively impacts on our work. And on other areas where epistemic communities could potentially emerge. I mean, I already mentioned climate change, and now, Tatiana, I will also use the term politicization, because this is something that really worries me, that there is an emerging politicization of the climate change issue in the debate between the EU and Russia. And I think, I mean, you know, I think the risk is that this will equally negatively impact on potential epistemic communities in this area. But so I think there are areas where there's a lot of potential, but the conditions are not very good. Thank you.
So next, dear Alexander, thank you very much for your very high evaluation of our chapter with my colleague Sirke Makinen. And actually, I have one comment on your comments on our chapter. I want to say that Russia is a part of European higher education area, and according to its last report of this year, actually, Russian students are the biggest, along with students in Turkey, the biggest cohort of students who are. For them, it is possible to study in any European country. And secondly, it was very interesting to me to find out that Russia, within its politics of export of its higher education, is so popular among students from several countries. For example, there is statistics that 80% of students from Kazakhstan, they receive degrees in Russia within this European higher education area, and more than 40%, 40 to 41 from Armenia, Belarus, Ukraine and Azerbaijan and Armenia, which means that actually Russia take a chance also to impact this academic mobility and those students from these countries to train in their own higher education system with including academic culture, principles and rules and values. So this is also just not to think that there is nothing exists between us, EU countries and Russia. It does exist, and it's called European higher education area, which is functioning. And responding to Tatiana's question, what two sides could do more to enrich and to enforce and probably to develop this cooperation, I would say that we find out that it's asymmetries in fundings and mobility, meaning that Russian government should devote more funds, to provide more funds for Russian students to study in any European university, because it's just impossible to compare the amount of money and how many students could study on European money and on Russian. Because as you know, global education project, it's less than 800 graduates only. It's so little. So this should be considered for sure to overcome this asymmetry in academic cooperation. Second, I think that somehow Russian government and institution should develop more trust and respect toward Russian academia, because we are under very strict watch, I would say, for our foreign contacts, and sometimes we are just waiting for if we would have some, very popular names that it's appeared now in Russia, that we are too foreign to be local. So this should be considered as very serious limitation for our developing our cooperation. So more trust and more respect toward Russian academicians. And the third, what I want to say, I represent humanities, and what I see, I work all my life in university, and I want to say that humanities needs more funding, and in a way of academic freedom, because humanities and social science are so important for the development of society in different ways. And we see that that Russia feels that it's need more engineers and physics, but in order to understand what's going on and how the country should develop, the country needs more educated and free of mind academicians from humanities. Thank you.
Thank you, Larissa. Alexander, back to you. And maybe you can also update us on the progress with the mutual recognition of the certificates, if there is anything.
Thankfully, Tatiana, this is not my cup of tea. This is the other economic department within the ministry that deals with it. So luckily, this is out of my hands. But certainly, I happen to wholeheartedly agree with Sabine that the pandemic itself and this issue of mutual recognition is certainly a barrier, not just to academic cooperation, but also to interaction, communication among diplomats. And this is something that, unfortunately, is quite noticeable. The repercussions are noticeable. I mean, you feel it, the length of time between communication, people rusty, the skills become rusty. So, of course, this needs to happen. Larissa, nobody doubts for a second the value of the European higher area and the work, the great work being done by Russian academics. This is a fact of life. Certainly, we need academic mobility. What I'm referring to is that certainly the amount of steam in this cooperation has really subsided. If you compare it to the preceding era, when we had the joint scientific and technology committee working along with, I think, 14 working groups under its aegis. Now there are just 3, 11 have shut down. And this is noticeable. Also with regard to the pandemic. We used to have a special channel at ministerial level for dialogue on health. It has not gotten together for 7 years now. So this is obvious. Regarding politicization, Tatiana, I think actually I tried very much to refer to it only once in my very concise remarks, but I did remark upon it. That's true. And here I'm very grateful to Sabine, because in her report, in her chapter, she remarks very eloquently on the way that Russian studies within Europe, well, first of all, she notes, and she said, she again, I think, put it quite correctly, that there is a trend towards Europeanization of studies within the EU. So there is a kind of a mainstream awareness of Russia that is evolving along certain policy lines, of course. But also there is a shift towards treating Russia as less as a topic for regional studies and more as a security issue, a security concern. And of course, that has implications. I understand that I'm open to criticism here regarding possible Russian countermeasures, but indeed, if you look at the recent strategy of the EU on innovation and research, I think published in May this year, you will see that it makes very specific mention of the need to guard against foreign interference. And of course, when that kind of language is used, you automatically have certain wariness about Russian academics, Russian think tanks. Is this a challenge to the formation of epistemic communities? I don't know. I think that's up to my academic colleagues to determine. But frankly, I'm a bit regretful that it is quite a rare occurrence nowadays to see Russian academics at EU-based debates, unless they are on Russia-EU relations, both online and offline. I regret that it has become a bit difficult to build durable partnerships between Russian and EU think tanks. It's an uphill battle. Some Russian academics have faced certain difficulties in gaining entry to certain EU member states, which have put them on notice, on stop lists. So I mean, this is the reality. Probably we should try to counteract against this trend, because this is going nowhere. But this is the reality, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. There is one question from Halita Pons. Can I give you a floor to? Can I give a floor to ask it? Could you unmute yourself, please? Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry. You have the power to mute and unmute people. It's a very well used power nowadays. So good. I had a very quick question to Sabine, but before I do so, since people touched the question of mutual recognition, and since we are in the broadly speaking academic community and we believe in rigor of terms, it's actually not called mutual recognition. It's called equivalence decision. So we're talking about equivalence of these things, which has a slight but important nuance. But of course, nevertheless, we all hope it can be reached sooner or later. But I had a question to Sabine. I understand that the academic community is epistemic, or rather, so the in this context that we are discussing, the ultimate goal would be to contribute to the policy making. How do you see the role of these communities in policy making in such a politicized relation as EU-Russia relation, where there is actually no one decision maker, since it's a decision that is done or taken together between many member states, and therefore it's a kind of the academic community doesn't have one addressee. And to be honest, if we don't want to hide the facts from ourselves, some of the decisions on particular areas are taken in a kind of a bundle of the political relations, right? So how do you see overcoming that obstacle? Over.
Okay, Sabine, and also there is a comment about journals. I don't know whether you saw it in the chat, so if you can take it, or if you would like to take it, that would be great.
I did see it. I'm terribly sorry, but I just had an internet problem, and I think I lost the first part of Yolita's question. But if I understood correctly, you were talking about how the academic community or expert community works on the European side, where we have such a diverse sort of and multi-level field of decision making, right? Okay, yeah, I mean, I think on the European side, this is exactly how the academic community works. I mean, you have the national levels and you have the European level, and many experts and academics rotate between these two levels, for instance, and communicate and interact with national governments, but also with EU institutions. And there are different formats and platforms to do that. So, and I mean, I agree with you in a way. The situation is, if you like, more chaotic than when you remain at the national level, or also when you compare between the situation in Russia and the EU, because indeed you have all these different levels. But on the other hand, I think for experts, this is also an opportunity, because you have more entry points through which you can influence discourses. And I mean, if you ask me, as an expert and researcher on EU-Russia relations or international relations, what you do is really you try to inform political debates and also decision-making processes with your ideas. You communicate, you engage with policymakers at these different levels, you offer your ideas. If you get closer to this decision-making, all the better, but usually what you do is you offer your ideas and you try to inform decision-making processes. It's very difficult to measure causal relationships between what you do at, on your own level as an expert, and what is then the outcome of decision-making processes, even if you stand right next to a decision maker. So I think this is, it's a very complex matter. And indeed, on the one hand, the situation in the EU makes things more complicated, but on the other hand, it also offers a lot of opportunities. On the journals, I would actually perhaps pass on that question to Larissa. I mean, just one point, perhaps. I think, I mean, if this is about academic journals, this really I would like to pass on to Larissa. But I mean, formats like the EUREN, for instance, I think they really have a great potential, because this is a format where there is really a kind of joint publication activity. And so this should be used much more, I think, for this kind of expert and research interaction. Academic journals, I'm not so sure. Larissa.
Thank you, Sabine. Actually, I'm not sure if there is a very thin academic infrastructure in terms of journals, because there is a journals exist in Russia and in outside of Russia many. The problem is that not all, if we talk about this, not all representatives of academia from Russia and EU countries speak the same language, I mean, literally, and also in the terms of a theoretical background, understanding of the issues, the way they speak about this. This is exactly about this existence or not existence of an epistemic community speaking the same language. But I also would like to say that, Sabine, you mentioned in your speech that actually there is another problem of epistemic community. It's how close or how approachable is those politicians to whom they are addressed. And this is another issue, because we do have in Russia growing these think tank institutions or something like this, and they do advise, but what we also know is that it's not clear how all these messages and how all these advices are heard. So this is, I would say, a very different way of how academia dealing or communicating with people in power. And I think this is also a big divide between Russian academia and those who are in the EU, still understanding that academic culture has some variation in different countries, in different ways of communicating with the political elites, with the government, and speaking to power, as we you say. So this is all, but we do have this particular difference. And I also want to say that I'm living in a region, and for example, when my academic advisor, who is now 90, and he's still very active, and he was able through entire Soviet time until now to go to the regional administration, to the local administration, and to find findings for the academic research, because he was able to explain why this research is important, why they need these studies, and why they need to meet with academicians. So somehow I'm in line with this, but I find that in Russia it's much more difficult and much more complicated. There is no institution for this kind of routine of cooperation between academia and different level of political institutions, and non-governmental as well as business also has these problems of big gap between academia and the real world, as we would say, still exist.
Well, this is something that we are trying to reverse with this book and with this discussion. However, we have to move on to the next session, and I'm passing it to Yanis.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Thank you to all who have participated in the previous panel. I think it was really an excellent and it was a very thoughtful debate, and I hope that we will continue in the same manner. The title of the next panel is Looking for Areas of Constructive Relations. And what we are going to do is we will dive a little bit deeper into two particularly important fields, energy relations and the Arctic. And in both fields, there is a history of cooperation between EU and Russia, but in both fields, it's also, it remains complicated and there are many question marks regarding the future. So we will start the panel with contributions from two authors from the Handbook before we give the word to Jolita Pons, who has thankfully joined us from the EU delegation. The first of our speakers will be Dr. Irina Kustova. She's a research fellow at the Center of European Policy Studies in Brussels. And she has contributed the chapter EU-Russia Energy Relations. And I'm happy to give the floor to Irina.
Okay, thank you very much, Yanis. Just to confirm that you can hear me well, yes? Perfect. And to start, of course, I would like just to join all these thanks and congratulations to our editors, to Tatiana and Maxine, and it was my pleasure to contribute to this book. And it was really interesting to write a chapter on EU-Russia energy relations, where there is a lot of course, empirical materials. And what I try to do in this chapter is to summarize and to provide a kind of an overview of previous studies, of various conceptual approaches, what has been done, what has been discussed so far, at least for the last 2 decades. So I welcome all of you who are interested in this topic just to read the chapter and to see how I approach it. But what I also try to do in my chapter is to offer a kind of a framework to analyze the relations in energy and also to some extent in climate. It can be used in all triangle: environment, energy, and climate. And this framework allows to analyze different specific issues in these relations and also to trace the evolution of these issues along the time. So what I'm proposing in my chapter is to distinguish 3 analytical categories of cooperation, institutionalized conflict, and institutional conflict. And I offer a table in the chapter with a lot of examples which summarize it. So cooperation is understood as a creation or an enhancement of existing international or bilateral institution, which is of course designed to mitigate differences, adjust norms, rules, and facilitate a common approach to energy issues. So like a very good example is the Energy Charter process in the early 2000s, when there were high aspirations to create a common framework, a common legally binding framework. And of course, the launch of the Energy Dialogue in 2000s and its early stages. as well as like a supply interdependence between the European Union and Russia is a good example. At some stages in the past is a good example of cooperation. Institutionalized conflict is understood as a disagreement regarding substantial or institutional settings of interactions, but which are still addressed within the existing procedures of the existing institutions, bilateral, multilateral. So examples would include, for example, international arbitration of long-term contracts between Gazprom and European companies. They use mediation in Russia-Ukrainian transit conflicts, and trilateral talks is also within this category. Also, the antitrust investigation by the European Commission and with the Gazprom. The third category, institutional conflict, is an expansion of disagreements regarding institutional settings or substantial issues beyond the existing institutions, which are no longer accepted as a means of conflict resolution by the parties. So the conflict is transferred into political space and may lead to weakening or even disappearance of existing institutions. And like the brightest example is the Energy Charter Treaty in mid-2010s when Russia withdrew from it, and the European Union has serious concerns about how to reform it or maybe even to quit it now. So how this framework can be applied to the current state of the relations? And what is the biggest question is what are the prospects for climate cooperation between the European Union and Russia? And what form should or could it take? So of course, currently there are hardly no dialogues. All dialogues are suspended. And of course, also in the light of COP26, in the light of climate, of a need to address climate issues, of course, there are some suggestions, some proposals, for example, for a climate partnership, any institutionalized form of cooperation, they are popping up in various policy briefs, in various discussions. What is important to keep in mind in this regards? Of course, prospects for institutionalizations have become ever elusive with the penetration of the political conflict into energy and climate sector. That's unfortunately inevitable, and also domestic developments in the EU and Russia. But at the same time, it's very clear that there is a need for reciprocal adjustments and adaptations at practical level. And in the first panel, we already discussed epistemic community, and we already heard that climate change, yes, it's becoming kind of politicized, but it's also a pressing issue to have a discussion on this topic between the parties. And of course, the ongoing changes, they offer great potential for both restoring cooperation, but also for deepening institutional conflict between the EU and Russia. And for cooperation, of course, it's essential because you all know that the European Union 2 years ago adopted the European Green Deal and followed initiatives and legislation with actually a very ambitious goal to become carbon neutral by 2050. And in its external dimension, in its climate diplomacy, it seeks to achieve the Paris Agreement targets and also to bring on board top emitters, both the EU and Russia top greenhouse gas emitters. And of course, addressing Russia and engaging with Russia will be key for reaching climate neutrality also on the European continent and globally. Also in Russia, we can see recently a lot of changes in addressing and taking climate change seriously. Russia ratified the Paris Agreement. Recently, we saw the adoption of the low carbon strategy with a goal also for carbon neutrality, no later than 2060. So we see that also Russia is increasingly moving in the direction of recognizing the importance of climate change. And of course, in this regard, some adaptations to decarbonization strategies, potential cooperation on climate climate research, of course, energy efficiency. They can be arranged through informal consultations, some technical consultations, which also ongoing, they're a bit restored now, and which in theory and ideally may lead to gradual de facto adjustments. But also conflict is possible. And interdependence, which we have been discussing, and we scholars, we studied it a lot extensively during last 2 decades, this interdependence will change and it will be readjusted due to decarbonization and due to EU's decarbonization commitments. So it will inevitably affect also Russia's hydrocarbon export to Europe and Russia's carbon-intensive economy. Would decarbonization lead to the potential for a new wave of institutionalized conflict? It might be very well, because we see a lot of discussions about the CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism, and potential to discuss it, let's say, within the WTO rules, within the WTO framework. And while the scale of EU decarbonization is yet unclear, there are very ambitious goals that will undoubtedly will have far more reaching institutional changes than the third energy package invoked 10 years ago. And these changes will affect all spheres of economy and also may signify another wave of institutional reconfiguration in EU-Russia relations. So I would like to wrap up with these very big and broad questions, whether sectoral cooperation on climate between the European Union and Russia would be able to mitigate the current political turbulence, or will it result in another breakup of the existing interactions, of the existing state of relations? And in my chapter, I try to provide an assessment of the previous EU-Russia initiatives for cooperation and where possible to highlight lessons from these initiatives, many of which failed, and to draw conclusions for future corridor for cooperation. I will stop here and I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Irina, for a fascinating presentation and extensive look into the future and the question of decarbonization, how it will affect the relationship. I think it's very important. We can already see that this is a theme which is going through all panels, probably. Climate change is also a factor in our next topic, which is the Arctic. And I'm very happy that we have Professor Alexander Sergunin with us. He's a professor for international relations at the State University of St. Petersburg. And he has contributed the chapter Russia and the EU in the Arctic to the handbook. Mr. Sergunin will share a presentation. I see it's already working. So, Alexander, you have the word.
Thank you very much, Yanis, for giving me the floor. Thank you very much, Tatiana and Maxine, for inviting me in this great handbook project, which I guess was very successful. I'm looking forward to getting more and more feedback on our endeavor. It seems to me that the topic of my chapter and my today's presentation is most relevant for our seminar, because finally the Arctic cold has arrived to the northern parts of Russia. Last night and morning we had -20. Now we have -15, which is unusual for this part of the year, for the St. Petersburg area, which normally has a milder climate due to the Baltic Sea, which is close to us. And this is in a sharp contrast with the extremely warm autumn which we had this year. So this is a very good illustration how climate changes. Climate changes all the time, that it is unclear in which direction. So I guess it's very important to have a good relationship and cooperation between European and Russian scientists, experts in climatology. And I guess only by joint efforts we can finally understand which climate change dynamics is and in which direction it goes on. But coming back to my topic of presentation and chapter, let me discuss how EU-Russia relations in the Arctic region evolved over the past quarter century. Well, there is a widespread stereotype, not only among the journalists or broad public, but also among some experts, that there is no cooperation between the European Union and Russia in the Arctic region, and that we do not interact anyhow. The source of this stereotype goes from the fact that Russia opposes granting the European Union permanent observer status in the Arctic Council. But this group of experts tends to forget that Arctic cooperation cannot be reduced only to the Arctic Council activities. And what I try to discuss today or demonstrate today that we do have many venues for bilateral cooperation. There were very specific research objectives with my study. First, to examine past and ongoing EU-Russian cooperative programs in the High North. Secondly, to discuss the problems and obstacles which impede cooperation between Brussels and Moscow in the region. And finally, to outline the prospects and identify opportunities for the future EU-Russian cooperation in the High North, in the short and mid-term perspectives. Of course, I cannot address all these issues during my brief presentation. Let me just focus on the positive experiences which we obtained over the last quarter of the century, and to discuss some prospects for the near future. This slide demonstrates the structure of so-called Arctic geopolitics.
Alexander, sorry to interrupt, but I think the presentation, it doesn't really work because the slides are not changing for us in Zoom. I've seen this problem before with Zoom. It's not unusual, but maybe you have to end the presentation mode and click to the presentation just through PowerPoint, because it doesn't show the slides changing for the participants.
Okay, but I can continue without slides. It's not necessarily true.
Or do that if you want to, yeah.
Okay, so let me start from the point that EU-Russian cooperation in the Arctic started already in early 1990s. First of all, through the so-called Romanova process, which was started in 1991 by the Finnish initiative, and the European Union and Russia interacted with each other through the European Union Nordic member states. Finally, the Romanova process ended up with the foundation of the Arctic Council in 1996. Then also we had another initiative launched by Norwegians, which was the Byron's Euro-Arctic Council, which was established in 1993. And it consists of 5 Nordic states, plus Russia, and plus European Commission. So European Commission is a full-fledged member of the Byron's Euro-Arctic Council, with the exception that European Commission cannot be chair in this institution. Only states can chair this council. Also, European Union cooperated with the Nordic political and financial institutions in the Arctic, and through them with Russia again. So we already in the 90s and the early 2000s had a lot of possibilities for bilateral cooperation. Then in 1997, Finland initiated the so-called Northern Dimension, which was formally approved by the European Union in 2000. And we had 2 action plans implemented from 2000 to 2007. And a lot of positive things has been done in the framework of Northern Dimension initiative. For example, things like construction of border infrastructure, environment protection projects, healthcare, small and medium-sized enterprises development, tourism, women's, youth, research, education, and sport cooperation. In 2006, at the end of 2006, Northern Dimension was reformed after the EU enlargement in 2004. The so-called the Baltic window was closed down, and only the Arctic window of Northern Dimension left. Instead of previous programs, 4 partnerships were established. First is the Northern Dimension Environmental Partnership, then Northern Dimension Partnership in Public Health and Social Well-being. Thirdly, Northern Dimension Partnership on Transport and Logistics, and Northern Dimension Partnership on Culture. Among these 4, the most effective was the Northern Dimension Environmental Partnership, and a lot of projects were implemented in the framework of this program. Also, partnership on transport and logistics was quite efficient, and highways, border crossings, other logistics were built in the northern part of Russia, in the border areas of Russia with the European Union countries, and also with Norway, which is not part of the EU. While other 2 partnerships on public health and social well-being and on culture, they are semi-dormant, and a lot should be done in the framework of these 2 partnerships. I skip the development of the conceptual basis of the European Union Arctic politics. Let me just mention that the first, more or less, coherent European Union Arctic strategy was adopted in November 2008. And since that, European Union regularly updates this strategy. The last update was European Council conclusions on the EU Arctic policy in December 2019. European Parliament also regularly monitors EU Arctic activities, and since 2011, European Parliament regularly passes resolutions on EU Arctic policies.
Alexander, if you could move to the final slide. I think we are approaching the end of the time now.
Yeah, I'm doing that. So what EU-Russia have in terms of platforms for the cooperation in the Arctic? First of all, Byron's Euro-Arctic Council, then the Arctic Council, especially working groups within it, and the European Union continuous funding for many projects under the auspices of the Arctic Council. Then we still have 4 Northern Dimension partnerships. We have 2 regional fishery organizations in the Northern Atlantic. We also have a special fishery regime for the Central Arctic Ocean. A special agreement was concluded in 2018, and both Russia and the European Union actively participate in maintaining and development of this regime. Plus, we have several United Nations bodies, such as International Maritime Organization, United Nations Environmental Program, United Nations Development Program, and several others. Also, we have 2 EU-Russia cross-border cooperation programs, such as Polar Arctic and Karelia. So let me conclude by saying that in the near future, the European Union will unlikely play a significant role in the Arctic because of several reasons. However, the European Union will affect Arctic affairs through indirect methods, such as international institutions. I named them. Also, several international regimes, I also called them, and also through the so-called Arctic science diplomacy, which was partially mentioned today. And in contrast with other areas of scientific cooperation between EU and Russia, Arctic science diplomacy is booming, and cooperation has very good prospects, especially during the Russian chairmanship in the Arctic Council. In other words, some chances for cooperation between the European Union and Russia in the Arctic remain, regardless of current tensions between them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexander, for a great presentation. I think we can end the screen share now. Perfect. And for a comment, I would like now to head to Dr. Julita Pons, who's the head of the political section of the EU delegation to Russia in Moscow. Julita, you have the floor. We can't hear you yet. Maybe, yeah, you need to be unmuted by our technical support. One second.
Yes, I think I've been given the permission. Colleagues, it was a very interesting and it was very exhaustive presentation. So I took my role of discussant very minimally as just making some remarks rather than making a presentation. And I see also we are running out of time. So the two speakers have outlined a couple of interesting areas, and they are well known of this constructive engagement or possibilities for constructive engagement. What I wanted to actually focus is on the looking part. I mean, I've been here, so the title of this session is Looking for Areas of Constructive Relations. So we keep on looking, whereas I think apart from looking for areas, we should try to preserve the areas that we have identified. So the ones that are climate and Arctic and other some kind of undisputably global goods. The way I see is that what we need to really make an effort, a concerted effort on both sides, is not to let these areas become hostages of our overall political relations. And there are several things that we need to do regarding that, including the escalation of rhetorics and quick mistrust about terms and intentions of the other party. Obviously, I'm speaking on not completely objectively, because I think that well, I represent a certain position. However, I think on both sides it needs to be done. And as for example, was mentioned the case of CBAM. I mean, it is very difficult for us to hear that we may have had some evil intentions, protectionist intentions behind the CBAM, because obviously CBAM was not invented or it's still in proposal stage, but it was not invented with Russia in mind, nor directed against Russia or any other country. It is, I think, a genuine effort by the European Union to achieve some of these climate goals that we have all seemed to subscribe. So that's an example. And broader speaking, climate indeed risks to become a little bit politicized. I think we took note also of the recent remarks by President Putin speaking to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that we should not let the European Union and the US decide the climate agenda. So I think that there is a lot of potential to work together on climate, and actually we do have, even though we don't have an institutionalized dialogue, we do have very constructive and good exchange with our Russian counterparts. Just to give the latest example is that we had a meeting between Deputy Prime Minister Overchuk and our Vice President of the Commission, Timmermans, in the margins of the COP26. Last year, we had a very big climate conference that was very well attended by our Russian partners, and we were planning to do a conference this year as well. We're running into some difficulties with this one, but so this there is a cooperation ongoing, but I think there is also a very real danger of it being hijacked by different political exploitations, and that's one of the issues that I wanted to highlight. And then the rest, I mean, for the areas like even the Arctic, obviously the Arctic is also a global good, and we have now a new Arctic policy which was unveiled in October this year, on the 13th of October, and obviously we had also immediate reactions also from the Russian side, and we understand fully the particular position of Russia on Arctic, given its geographical position, that is more than understandable. But we had one of the proposals in our Arctic policy is to ban the extraction of hydrocarbon reserves in the Arctic, which I mean, according to many scientists, is the right way to go. Obviously, that was again met with the reaction as if it were aimed against Russian interests. So this is this. I think the more than looking for more and more areas of constructive engagement, which at the current stage of relations is not probably such a realistic outlook. I think we should focus on preserving the ones that we have identified jointly, and such as climate, Arctic, and also the health, well, obviously we have this cross-border cooperation and northern dimension that are working very well, and so on. So this for me, the question is, I just wanted to focus not on looking for areas, but for keeping the areas for now, and working together on promoting these things that can be really considered going beyond our mutual interests and beyond our mutual relations, because they really concern global goods. I will stop here. Over.
Thank you very much, Jolita, for I think a very important comment. And I will straight go to the discussion and open the floor. I already see several questions. I would like to start with a raised hand that I'm seeing from an account which is doesn't have a clear name, Elena Kut 44. I think it's Elena. If you want to ask your question, please introduce yourself briefly, and then ask your question, please. While I think, okay, while Elena is still working on her connection, I will start with the questions which already accumulated in the chat. There's one question on German-Russian relations, but I will put that to the end for now, because it is not really on the subject of this panel. I hope for your understanding, Mikhail Ivanov, that I will move on to the questions which are more to on the topic of today's discussion. The first one is from Federica Brendan from EUREN in Paris. It is directed to Irina Kostova. So how seriously do Russian political and business elites take global warming and the investment in the green economy? Is it posturing or a true change of tide? How will Russia respond to EU climate strategies such as Fit for 55 or hydrogen? So this is the first question directed to Irina Kostova. And then I see a question from Maya Baumann from Kent University in Brussels. A question to Professor Segunin. Do you see a projection of the current tensions in the EU-Russia relationship to the Arctic? Or could the dialogue on the topic spark close engagement and cooperation? From the Russian perspective, what role does the EU play in the Arctic as opposed to other global players? So before we give back to the speakers, I will try once more and ask Elena again to unmute herself and ask the question if she still wants to ask a question. And I don't think it's happening. So I will give the floor back to our speakers in the same order like in the first round. And I will also want to give the opportunity to our two speakers from the first round to react to the comment from Jolita Pons. So we will start again with Irina Kostova. You have the floor.
Thank you, Yanis. Well, to answer this question, well, it's a very broad, and it's very difficult to answer indeed. I think, well, I will start with the observations, the political and business elite. So whether they react to the current changes or not. And I think, like, from the political side, we all can already see some changes. And also from the highest political level, there has been a reaction. And I think that Russian political elites are starting taking climate seriously. as a part of international relations, as part of international politics. And of course, for many business stakeholders, European Union's actions, policies during last 2 years were kind of a wake-up call. And I'm speaking about also a proposal for carbon border adjustment mechanism, but also many others. And in this regards, of course, the discussions, and I have observed in the last 2 years, the discussions and the events on these topics, they have skyrocketed. And my main comment will be about that maybe we will not see like immediate changes in policies, immediate changes in corporate strategies. But what is important to understand, and I think that the Russian colleagues, the Russian business understand it, that currently global changes, well, we can discuss whether energy transition is moving fast enough, whether all these settled goals, objectives will be reached within the allocated time limits or not. But what is clear is that energy transition is happening. It's happening globally. It's happening in different paths in different regions. But this is the direction. This is the directions for future supply chains, for future economies. And currently what is happening is settling rules of the game for new carbon neutral, if I may say, carbon neutral economies. And history and past experience shows that it's better to participate in settling these rules of the game and to be part of the game than to stay aside and just to observe, because in the end you will be exposed to a need to accept the rules that were decided without you. And I see that from Russian side, there is growing understanding of this and growing interest to participate in this in these decisions. And of course, also I feel there is interest of investment in the green economy. And also Ruslana Delgiriev spoke about this recently at Valdai. So I would think that there will be more interest from Russian business as well. And if speaking about potential maybe cooperation or whatever, of course, case-by-case dialogue, maybe even joint declarations on, maybe even on hydrogen, technological assistance, research cooperation, that all can continue, that can all be part of EU-Russia dialogues. And of course, what the European Union has, and that directly relates to new rules of the game, is regulatory powers that also used to work pretty well, also in relation to Russia in the past. And that's also usability to set standards, regional and global standards. And I'm speaking about hydrogen, I'm speaking about methane. Also CBAM is here. So there is plenty, like a room for like EU to provide, let's say, a platform for engagement with Russia and to provide a room for like exerting certain type of leverage, I would say so. And for Russia to respond to this and to react.
Thank you very much. I will try once more to get Elena's question. Elena, if you can hear us, your mic is unmuted now, so you can speak. If you have a question, introduce yourself briefly, please. No, it doesn't seem to work. Okay, then we will move on to Alexander. And after that, we will go to Julita as well, but first we start with Alexander.
Yeah, I've got a question about whether there was a spillover effect from the EU-Russian tensions to the Arctic. Yes, of course, there was a negative spillover effect. Let me just give some examples, such as, for example, EU sanctions against offshore gas and oil projects in the Russian Arctic zone. All projects with the European companies' participation were cancelled, as well as American ones as well. Then also there were no direct sanctions, but there was a sort of recommendations on the European part that European companies should not participate also on onshore gas and oil projects in the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation. While the Yamal LNG project was implemented with the participation of French Total company, but the second LNG plant project, which is called Arctic 2 LNG, again in the Yamal Peninsula, European companies they refused to participate over there, and Russia, Novatek had to invite again Chinese and Japanese partners to finalize this project. Well, also other programs like EU-Russian cross-border cooperation programs and the Northern Dimension programs, they experienced the lack of funding on the part of the European Union. There were a lot of delays with funding. And as I mentioned, two Northern Dimension partnerships on healthcare and culture, they are semi-dormant, both because of the lack of funding and also some normative differences, because we differently see the prospects and the essence of cooperation in these areas. Plus, pandemic contributed negatively to these issues. But I think that anyway, we already have some platforms for cooperation between EU and Russia. And I think that there's some maybe some grounds for cautious optimism we still have in this area.
All right, thank you very much, Alexander. Now we have the final word to Julita Pons. And Julita, feel free to address the questions that were asked in the chat that I just read, or react to what the authors of the chapters just said. And yeah, tell us if you share Alexander's optimism with regards to these cooperation issues. You have the floor. Just a second.
Yes, well, I think the previous questions, thank you, were answered by the speakers, and I think that it's also clear that the academic community has this role that we diplomats cannot afford, is identify faults on both sides. So that is, I think, that is the value of the academic freedom and freedom of expression, and I'm happy about that. Now I see there is one question, and I don't want it to be long, but everybody can read in the chat. It's indeed a very interesting question about genuine efforts and hidden agenda, and that leads to the fundamental lack of trust issue currently in the EU-Russia relations, and how we can all creatively come up with what in conflict prevention and other areas is called conflict building measures, right? So we need some serious CBMs ourselves. So the areas that we have been talking about in themselves, in a way, even though I have explained that they also risk being hijacked, but in themselves they are areas of confidence building between us, because when you work together, you also have to trust the partner, and you discover that the partner is not so different from you, maybe after all, in some areas. But obviously that's a bit, maybe we don't have time to go into a long discussion on that, just to highlight that the question of this genuine efforts and hidden agendas is actually at the core, of course, of our current woes in EU-Russia relations. Over.
Thank you very much, Julita. I think this was a great final statement. We already came to the end of the second panel. Time flies, and I'm again grateful to all of you who've participated, the presenters, and also those who have asked questions during this debate. I will now give the word to Maxine, who will chair our final panel. Maxine.
Thank you very much. So this panel is the Going Global, Going Regional section of today's program, and we'll begin with hearing from Sergei Utkin, who heads the strategic assessment section at the Primakov Institute of World Economy and International Relations, and swiftly followed by Laure Delcourt, who's an associate professor at the Sorbonne Nouvelle, and I believe is also still a visiting professor at the College of Europe. Now, their two chapters fell into two different sections in the handbook. So Sergei's is about the EU, Russia, and global governance, and Laure's fell into the section on regional relations. They're both excellent chapters, as with the others, and they stand very well alone, but are also very much worth reading as parts of those bigger sections for those who are interested in this aspect of EU-Russia relations. And we're also going to hear the thoughts of Elena Danilova of the Eurasian Economic Commission in Moscow, a great choice, may I say, considering these two papers. Could I ask as well, just to kind of expedite things, if you can be putting your questions again into the chat as they occur to you, and it might be worth doing this anyway. We'll try and give you the floor, but since we've experienced a few problems here, maybe if you could put them into the chat as well, in case we can't give you the floor. So thank you very much. And with no further ado, I would like to hand over to you, Sergei.
Thank you, Maxine. And indeed, it's a great pleasure to speak about this collection of very different chapters. Each of them showed some interesting angle of EU-Russia relationship. Myself, I dealt with a very specific angle of this global governance that Maxine mentioned, which is multilateral institutions, and some specific multilateral institutions that Russia and the EU are engaged in, or they somehow decide how to deal with them in this way or another. When I first heard from the editors of the book that they were thinking about a chapter that would deal with the Council of Europe, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I first thought that this is a weird idea, that it's such a different set of organizations. Each of them is very specific and not the same as the others, not even the same area where they operate. That it makes little sense to have them all in one chapter. But then I had a closer look, and I discovered that dealing with those organizations helped me to reveal certain features of EU-Russia dialogue that actually matter, and that show the ways how the EU and Russia, in their turn, approach multilateral institutions. Institutions are different, but the multilateralism itself matters in this regard. In case of the OSCE, for example, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, you could see that many of the tensions that some people believe just appeared between Russia and the West, and also between Russia and the EU in the last few years, like within the last decade, they actually have a longer record, and you can trace them back to at least the beginning of 2000s or earlier than that. Actually, the way the post-Cold War environment was shaped already shaped as well those tensions between Russia and the West. First, they were not that acute, then they became more sharp. But looking at the attitudes to the OSCE process, you could see exactly those tensions developing. You could see the impact caused on this interaction between Russia on the one hand and Western institutions on the other by the enlargement of Western organizations, by the enlargement of both NATO and the European Union. When in the 1990s, you still had a situation when quite a number of countries look at the OSCE, looked at the Council of Europe as the platforms where they could interact with others in this broad region of Europe or even Euro-Atlantic. And the EU or NATO were just aspirations for some, or partners for cooperation for others. And a decade later, you had those Western institutions dramatically enlarged. So for a bigger number of countries, those institutions, the European Union, NATO, became the central ones in terms of multilateral interaction, in terms of their engagement in the regional politics. And the institutions that were significant before that, like the OSCE, the Council of Europe, they became sort of more niche or even marginalized. And that is at the time when, for Russia, these remained the institutions where it had its full say. It had a position of a participating state, of a full member, and the same rights as others. So it was natural for Russia to try to use those institutions, and that didn't go without disappointments, unfortunately. So we saw how that was indeed the attempt to still push those all-encompassing institutions, the institutions that had everybody as a participating member, in the center of European politics. And then you saw that Russia, well, realistically came to a conclusion that this doesn't really work, that when most states, indeed most states, like more than half of all states involved in the Council of Europe or the OSCE, they see as the most principal to them NATO or the European Union, then you may not really expect that they will treat other organizations as just as important. And that meant that for Russia, the conclusion was that the investment had to be made not in the development of those multilateral institutions, because it was without perspective, but in its own sovereignty, its own ability to act without really relying too much on those multilateral institutions. So this is the way we saw Russian involvement developing in organizations where Western countries were also members. But then the question could be that, well, probably it would be easier if Russia was involved in one multilateral organization. The West would develop its own multilateral organizations like the EU, NATO, and then they would cooperate with each other. And we do have a case that shows how this could or could not rather work, which is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This is the case where Russia is indeed not a dominant member. It's not like with the Eurasian Economic Union, where people speculate all the time about Russia being the mightiest, and that's why other countries sort of much less important. In case of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you have not just Russia, you have China. You have two major world powers trying to develop multilateral regional cooperation. And the question was that I addressed in my chapter, how the Western countries, how the European Union in this case, approach this organization developed by China and Russia. And you see that in this case, where the organization is excluding Western countries, they are not enthusiastic about developing ties to this organization that is excluding them. They criticize the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They see it as run by authoritarian states. They have all sorts of reproaches that we all know to Russia, to China, of different nature, but when they are taken all together, they basically mean that the EU thinks it's not a good idea to develop cooperation with such an organization run by such countries with which it has so many disagreements and tensions. And that basically means that the world that we are living in is characterized by this gap between the Western approach, the approach that is attempted by Russia and a number of other countries. When the Western countries, they do think that yes, their institutions, they are based on values, they are the best frameworks to develop, to invest in, and if some countries are not involved, it's a problem of those countries. It's the function of their underdevelopment, of the fact that they are not at the standard of the EU, NATO, and they have to sort of change in order to be good partners for the Western organizations. And on the other hand, you have the different approach, the approach that Russia is trying to develop, that whatever the internal architecture of certain country is, this is still a sovereign country that has the right to determine what they do in domestic politics. But if we think that they're an important partner internationally, like what Russia thinks about China, what China thinks about Russia, we have to interact with them. We can develop a multilateral framework even. And if the West is not very happy with that, it's the problem of the West. So everybody is sort of not very eager even to listen to the other side, to cooperate with the other side, and this produces this gap in security terms, in terms of cooperation in various fields, that is becoming more significant in the last decade, and that leads to basically divided rather than undivided security environment in our region and beyond.
Thank you very much, Sergey, for that. And we actually won back a couple of minutes, so doubly thank you to you for that. And let's go straight now to Laura, please.
Thank you, Maxine. So my chapter focuses on EU-Russia interaction in the so-called common neighborhood, so Eastern Europe and South Caucasus, and it seeks to explain the sharp deterioration of EU-Russia interaction and the clash between their policies in the region over the past decade. In doing so, I was also requested by the editors to study the explanations that have been put forward in the academic literature to account for the spillover of tensions. So I start by analyzing how a growing sense of mistrust developed between the EU and Russia in the 2000s, with key milestones such as the gas crisis in Ukraine, the war in Georgia. So overall, the common neighborhood increasingly turned into a mirror image of the EU's and Russia's increasingly divergent views on a number of issues. The academic literature initially pointed to the difference between the EU's and Russia's international actorness to explain this growing mistrust. The EU was predominantly presented as a normative actor, while Russia was depicted as a geopolitical player or even as a negative actor. In my view, this sharply contrasted picture has led to blind spots in the analysis of EU-Russia interaction in the region. And this is because it regards both actors as monolithic and thereby misses important nuances in their policies. In fact, as was argued by Derek Aver in a major article, neither actor can be characterized as a purely normative or as a purely non-normative actor,
Instead, both combine elements of normative and structural power. Shifting to the past decade, so starting in 2009, 2010, I regard the emergence of two deep economic integration projects as a turning point in EU-Russia interaction. And this is because these two projects, so the deep and comprehensive free trade agreements proposed by the EU as part of the Eastern Partnership and the Eurasian Economic Union, these two projects are much more ambitious in terms of scope, depth, and methods of integration than their predecessors. And therefore, their creation paved the way for a chain of interactions and clashes between the EU's and Russia's policies, which culminated in Ukraine in early 2014. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the academic interpretations of these events were equally sharply polarized. For some, for instance, Richard Sakwa, the European Union carries a major responsibility in failing to achieve a continental vision of Europe in which Russia could integrate, and thereby triggered what has been interpreted as a counter-hegemonic offensive by Russia. By contrast, in explaining the clash between the EU and Russia's policies, other scholars ascribe a key importance to Russia's combination of region building and region spoiling actions, especially in Ukraine. Yet again, such a polarized analysis, which also presents, by the way, the neighborhood as being divided between pro-EU and pro-Russian countries, such a polarized analysis results in academic blind spots. The picture is in fact much more complex, with dividing lines passing through the countries and multifaceted ties to both the EU and Russia developing in most countries. Crucially, in most analyses seeking to explain the clash between the EU's and Russia's policies, the countries located between them have remained a missing variable. And I identified two research avenues for bridging this gap. First, we need more in-depth analysis of perceptions, local identities in Eastern European and South Caucasus countries. This would provide an enriched understanding of the partner countries' receptivity to the EU's and Russia's policies, so how these policies actually resonate in the field. And this is especially important as local receptivity is both complex and shifting. Second, in my view, we need closer scrutiny of domestic reforms and local political trajectories in the so-called in-between countries, and this is needed in light of the different foci of the EU and Russia, meaning sector-specific reforms for the EU, political, geopolitical loyalty for Russia. This is also needed to make sense of potentially hybrid engagements, such as the one illustrated by Armenia's continuous quest for closer links with the EU despite joining the Eurasian Union. So overall, my chapter argues that the evolution of EU-Russia interaction on the one hand and domestic developments in the contested neighborhood on the other hand, are intimately intertwined. Both the EU and Russia will remain key actors in the region in the near future. For instance, the implementation of the association agreement, which is a litmus test for the European Union's influence in the region, will crucially hinge on domestic capacities and EU assistance, but it will also be affected by Russia's actions. The region as a whole will remain pivotal to Russia's diplomacy, and any Western initiative aimed at deepening integration will continue to be perceived as detrimental to Russia's interests. However, and despite Russia's attempts to contain its influence, the EU is likely to remain attractive to many countries in the region, whether as a beacon of democracy, as a template of modernization, or even if only as a counterweight to Russia. So it will likely continue to appeal to some Eurasian Union members, especially in light of this organization still mixed records. And therefore, I argue in the chapter that the contested neighborhood has become much more than just a theater for EU-Russia interaction. In fact, what happens there and what will happen there in the near future will likely bear substantial implications for the whole of EU-Russia relationship. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Laure. One of the real benefits, I think, of the handbook is that we do end up with our authors conveying the need for much more nuance, for understanding the complexities. And I think that this was a perfect example of that. Anyway, if I could hand over now to you, Elena, for your comments, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting. And I'm from the beginning of this discussion, and with pleasure and with very big interest, I hear the discussion on epistemic communities. Why on epistemic communities? Because I think it's a basic element in relation of EU-Russia when we try to launch some process of better communication between two communities, between Eurasian Economic Union and European Commission. I would like to focus mostly, notwithstanding that it was very interesting presentation, and I thank you, thanks a lot for the authors of the chapters. And but from the point of view of multilateral institution, now for me more to my heart, more close the economic focus. And I would like to remind the evolution and preconditions which could play a positive role in order to reset the relations between the European community and the Eurasian Union, and to move a little bit forward than just only technical dialogue, which now established between these two integration organizations. The evolution was like that in 19th, it was a very, very extensive epistemic communities dialogue, which was, and the result of which will create the basis for the next step to prepare investigation, which we met the time, it was beginning of 2000s, between us with SEPs, by the way, and to present to the summits in 2003, 2004, or results for creation of economic space between Russia and the EU. Then this next stage was a project partnership for modernization, which was launched in the period when we negotiating our membership in WTO organization. And there was also very extensive dialogue with EU within this negotiating process. And third stage was a new basic agreement. The negotiations was start, but after 1904, all the projects was frozen. And there was some problems and some contesting in the period when the customs union was created between Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. And it was misunderstanding between EU. And I should say that I was in negotiating process in EU and on both projects on creation of economic cooperation, economic space with EU and customs union creation. And the direction of EU at that time was, it was, as I said, rather contesting than open for the new phase of cooperation when some competence was given already on the international level. On the level, on the national level in our Eurasian Union. And then, as I said, the dialogue was approximately frozen. And so we have experience. We have very extensive experience to prepare, launch different projects, big projects, which are supported on, was at that time supported on a high political level. And I should say that if you have the high support on political level, then you can involve all the scientific and research communities. And that time when we prepare our proposals for the building of this big building European and Russia space, and for partnership modernization, we always use the competence and of research and development, different research and development centers. So we use these epistemic communities very, very hardly. What should be done now? How to make the next step from the technical cooperation, which we have now, to more wider dialogue. Well, first of all, Sergei Utkin mentioned Shanghai organization. I remember that in 2007 in Berlin, there was even conference, Shanghai organization, possibilities for partnership with EU. And there was some attempts. I remember that Klaus Mangelt was participated in this conference. There was some attempts to find the issues which could be interested for EU and participants of Shanghai organization. But nothing was done further after this conference, but the experience was. So if you would like to use something, we should sometimes to see back, and I'm sure we can find a lot of deal which was not finished, but still could be used. So the second idea could be, for example, to establish some expert dialogue on the basis what is done in European Union, what is done in Eurasian Commission. Recently, we launched a strategic of development of Eurasian Union, and contains a lot of elements which could be interested for EU experts. And at the same time, this document contains one of the tasks is analysis of integrational practice. And we are our experts working in Eurasian Commission are very interested in studying and using some elements of practice which is used in European Commission and the EU, and within the relations EU and EAST countries. So it could be some of topics for launching more wider dialogue than just only technical dialogue. Secondly, launching this exchange of integrational practice between EU and Eurasian Commission, we can also be more aware about what is done, for example, in the field of digitalization, different process in Eurasian Union. For example, now we are in process of digitalization of customs procedures and transit, and which plan to be open agreement. Transit agreement should be open for the third countries, third participants. So just only simple practical example. We have a lot of such projects launched within this strategy, and so I see that there could be possibilities for more close cooperation. And of course, taking into account that I'm working now in economic organization, we have no political aspects, but only economic focus. I would like to say that we have a lot of a lot of to do within the World Trade Organization and reform of World Trade Organization. Unfortunately, because of pandemic, ministerial conference was moved for another some time, but it should be done now. But unfortunately, it's not happens. But at the same time, topics and issues are very, very wide. And four members of our Eurasian Union are participants, members of WTO organization. And on this, within this multilateral organization, we can continue and develop our dialogue with the EU. And experts and so-called the epistemic communities could give a lot of in trade policy, because I would like once again to stress all our epistemic input in further these projects of 2000 was done in 19th, and it was start from trade policy dialogue. Trade policy dialogue, in fact, the launch all the projects of wider dialogue in 2000s. So that's what my reaction on what I heard, and I welcome experts to be more close with us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this marrying of the first part of our program with this final part. I think that's very thought-provoking. I'm happy to see that Mr. Busarov is still with us, and in the absence of hands up or questions in the chat, I think it would be foolish of me not to offer you the opportunity to give your thoughts on what you've just heard in this final section, if you would like to, of course, Mr. Busarov.
Yes, thank you very much, Maxine. Indeed, I listened with great attention to all the previous panelists, and indeed, it is a very interesting and live discussion. Certainly, just to respond, while I have time, to the earlier question posted online about the genuine efforts versus hidden agenda, I'd just like to wholeheartedly support what my colleague from the EU delegation, Yulita Pons, said earlier, that indeed, for cooperation to be genuine, you need trust. And I think trust can only be rebuilt, in this case, between Russia and the EU, incrementally, not just through dialogue, which still exists on many different levels, but by taking dialogue to practical action and doing things together. This is the only way to gain trust. And this is why it is so important for us to have these discussions and to come to this understanding of why epistemic communities are necessary. They're necessary to envision the possible landing zones, possible compromises in many different areas, be it Arctic, climate, digital, trade, etc., etc. So for this reason, I think what I've heard is has been very, very valuable. All of these have been very valuable contributions. And of course, maybe a kind of a provocative question, maybe, if I may, to Sergei Utkin, because the OSCE and the Council of Europe are also pet hobbies of mine, to put it bluntly. I mean, in both organizations, you see the European Union over time behaving in a more cohesive manner as an entity that encompasses the majority, or a big group, a big chunk of the membership. So the question is, can this regional intergovernmental multilateralism survive the inclusion of supranationalism inside it? That would be interesting to learn. And thank you once again.
Thank you very much. Before I go back to Sergei and Larissa, I believe you have a comment or a question, please.
Thank you, Maxine. Very briefly, and somehow my question goes to all the three participants of this discussion, to Sergey, to Lur, and to Elena. And actually, for me, it's a dilemma how to choose and how to make the cooperation better, concentrated more focus on technical aspect of cooperation and just leave aside contextual. This is what is divide quite often the EU, Russia, and how you would solve these dilemmas of going too much into technicals and just leaving aside different important aspects of communication. And just also a very short remark on what Elena just said. I think that somehow epistemic community are really much broader than just executive bodies as the EU Commission and the Commission for Eurasian Union. And what we are presenting here, it's a little bit more than people who are involved directly in decision making and implementing these decisions. So we are looking forward for enlarging epistemic community in Russia and in cooperation of EU and Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So can we go back to Sergey, please?
Thank you. Answering Alexander Gusarov's question on multilateralism and supranationalism, I think indeed, of course, it's a challenge because if the EU is the most principal institution for its members that goes way beyond economic issues up to foreign policy, security policy. These days you have the security policy of the EU discussed specifically vividly with this so-called strategic compass that the EU is developing. Then the question is, yes, if you bring those countries that put so much effort into negotiating their common stance with a bunch of other countries, is there still a room for negotiations, for agreeing on something? I think, of course, it's not easy to proceed from this common EU position. But on the other hand, we could look at the WTO, for example, where the EU participates as a united entity. And then other countries negotiate, taking into account the EU position, or say the negotiations on climate, where the EU is pretty much integrated. So probably at this point, the problem is that you do indeed have areas where supranationalism triumphs, where the competences are brought up to the level of the European Union, and certain EU structures can develop them from some basic strategic directions given by member states. So they don't have to go back to member states time and again. And then you can negotiate with this EU position with people who have powers given to them by the member states. In case of foreign policy, in case of pretty much all the political issues that are discussed, or most of the political issues that are discussed in the OSCE or in the Council of Europe, you still have very heavy influence of the member states. And time and again, people who are sort of pushed to the surface of negotiations by the EU to represent the EU, they have to keep in mind the fact that the positions of EU member states on those issues are actually quite diverse. And this prevents them from doing almost any step independently, because they understand every time that there could be harsh criticism with regard to what they are doing on the part of the member states. So this limits the abilities of EU representatives in such organizations on the one hand, and on the other, it makes it very difficult for other countries to cooperate with the EU, because you approach the EU you say, well, look, we have some ideas in mind, and the EU says, well, we have our formulated position that cannot be changed because with all our member states, we could only find this consensus, and we cannot find any other consensus at this point. So yes, this is not easy, but we have also probably to keep in mind the dynamics that is the dynamics of the EU's role in international system. It doesn't stay always the same, and probably the enthusiasm about the EU's ability to develop its own foreign and security policy will also develop, not necessarily in the direction of more enthusiasm. What we see these days, for example, I would interpret as transferring more hopes and more competences in the Western community with regard to security issues to the transatlantic level. There is a number of EU countries that have more, indeed, hopes related to this interaction with the United States that would improve their security, and not really the European Union. That's on the one hand. On the other, you have this growing tension between NATO and Russia, and probably not without a crisis, not without some very bitter developments that still can happen. We could come to the idea that eventually this very serious discussion of what could be the security arrangements that could work for everyone would happen. And it would happen not between the EU and Russia, it would happen between Russia and, say, the transatlantic community of nations, whether it is embodied by NATO or just by individual countries. So this is a process that will probably also influence what we can expect in terms of EU-Russia cooperation, and which will be the areas that would be promising in terms of this cooperation. And just very briefly, I would agree with what Larissa pointed out, that indeed, sometimes we sort of get fascinated by the ability to make certain steps in some technical areas, ignoring bigger issues that eventually kill progress made in those technical areas. So, of course, it's important to face the realities, to admit that we do have very serious contradictions, and not to make it look like they don't exist. I think be it on the experts level or on the official level, when people try to make things look more rosy than they are, this is not really helpful, at least with the kind of serious tensions between Russia and the West that we witness these days.
Thank you very much, Sergey. We did start this a little bit late, so I'm just going to, we were 5 minutes late starting this section. I'm going to resist the temptation to get into an argument with you, Sergey, about multipolarity versus multilateralism. We sounded sometimes perilously close to that type of a discussion. But really kind of picking up on your second point, Laura, I know that you have other points to answer here as well, but I wondered if you wanted to say anything about we've heard, I think, kind of some possibilities for how we might manage things in the medium to longer term, but we are confronted with a very challenging immediate situation today in the neighborhood. And I wondered if you wanted to comment at all on what is going on right this moment there, and how we might move beyond this to some happier times. But I also understand that this is a very fluid situation as well, and you might want to sidestep that for now.
Yes, well, this is a very complex issue and question, and the situation is extremely fluid and extremely complex as well. I don't think there is scope for any substantial EU-Russia cooperation in the neighborhood, at least in the short to medium term. And getting back to Larissa's comment, well, certainly there is scope for technical cooperation between the EU and Russia in some specific areas. I think the previous panel mentioned, for instance, environment, or let's say education, student exchanges could be such an area. And such a cooperation could possibly spill over to the neighborhoods, meaning reversing or starting reversing the dynamics of deterioration. Having said that, I mean, there is fundamentally a lack of trust between the EU and Russia in the neighborhood, as Sergei just said also, and that is the first point. And my second point would be that in order for any cooperation between the EU and Russia to develop in the neighborhood, then such cooperation would have to involve closely the partner countries in the region. And I mean, from the outside, from the design phase, this is fundamental.
Thank you very much. Yelena, I don't know if you would like to come back. We really just only have 1 or 2 minutes then.
I would like to support and Larissa and Sergei and Laura that, of course, if we think about the establish modern dialogue, which which can estimate the global changes in the world. Of course, to have just only technical dialogue, it's too little. And of course, we should start and with expert community to design something more than just only resolving concrete problems. And that's why I would like to repeat once again that Eurasian Union have now as a strategy of development, the elements of which could be just like breaks to create a new building of the confidence between EU and Eurasian Commission. And I would like to remind also that when we're speaking about multilateralism, subnational level, national level, that our dialogue partnership for modernization was created and designed in such a way when we have the dialogue with the European Commission and we have dialogues with all member states. The dialogues with the member states was contain some plans of cooperation in the field of trade, investment, etc. And the dialogue with EU, is European Commission, was much more broader and involved more topics, including education, including climate, including technical regulation, including rights of people and corruption, for example, and many other aspects. Of course, the competition of competence of Eurasian Commission is only much more closer than the broad, which could be in broad dialogue. We are economic organization, so we can propose only trade and economic issues, but it's not obviously technical issues. They could be much more wider and in different fields of industry, agriculture, digitalization, climate, customs procedures, and medicine, security. So we have a lot of to do within our documents of strategy, and that's why we invite the expert community to maybe next year to organize something like establishing some bridge dialogue via expert community with EU and experts of our commission to discuss much more broader topics, which could create maybe then some good paper on like this book which was presented now, but more focusing on economic field.
Thank you very much. Always happy to end a panel with ideas for a future research agenda. So thank you very, very much. I would like to hand over now to Ivan so that we can go to our closing remarks. And thank you very much to all our speakers for this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maxine. Well, needless to say that I enjoyed the discussion, which allowed to revisit the key findings of the book. And again, I must stress, I should stress that it's really an achievement that we have combined both the energy of the EUREN and of the team of authors, which completed and produced such a great volume. And again, I would like to convey my gratitude both to Tanya and Maxine and to all of the authors and members of EUREN for their cooperation with RIAC and their contributions. So needless to say again that I do hope for our future cooperation.
Can I just briefly come in?
Sure.
To thank all our authors. It's been a great pleasure to work with all the authors, and I personally learned a lot from you. So thank you very much for taking part in this project. I would like to also thank all the participants, all authors who presented their chapters, and all discussants for their time and for their useful comments. Thank you very much to the audience. Thank you very much to RIAC for hosting this event, especially for hosting it in these sort of like period of celebrations that you have. I know that you are very busy with all other activities. And special thanks to Julia for handling all practicalities. So thank you.
I'd just like to echo all of those thanks as well. And I'd just like to add that I'm looking forward to teaching my bachelor students EU-Russia relations next semester and reminding them that all of these technical details are actually vital. They are vital for helping us go into even worse situations than we have currently. Without them, where would we be? Will be the question that I will ask them when they're asking me why they really need to read all of the details of these documents that underpin EU-Russia relations. So just to say that for, I mean, obviously those who are here anyway are interested in this, but I hope that there are some too as well who see this relationship as a really important one to understand if we are to understand wider international relations as well. One of my criticisms of foreign policy analysis generally is that we don't concentrate enough on area studies in order to understand the wider international scene, a point which I think was made very powerfully here today. So thank you.
All right. Thank you also from my side. I think there's almost nothing left to say, but to wish everybody a wonderful afternoon or an evening in Moscow. And I really look forward to continuing our discussion in the next year. Thank you also to Julia. I know there was a lot of work in the background, and it was a pleasure working with you on this event. And yes, I hope we can also continue that in the next year. And of course, yes, I think it's obvious by now, get the handbook, read it, it's really worth it. And thank you for attending this event, and goodbye.